Hi, Misha here, and we have not done a long video in a while, and people have asked about revisiting Yugoslavian guns. So we're going to lay some out on the couch and go through them again. Why not? From the beginning of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia after the Great War, World War I, through Tito, the Cold War, the Third World Era, the Communist era, up through the end of Yugoslavia, the civil wars, the tragic wars, Kosovo and all that. But we're going to talk about their service guns, mostly rifles, but also handguns, and a few other things besides. I don't know, again, haven't done a long video in a bit, and people really do seem to respond well to Zastava guns. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to Patreon. With that, let's go to the table and actually turn on the light. So, beginning at the beginning of Yugoslavia, a kingdom formed out of a conglomeration, including Serbia, following the Great War, the First World War. It had basically a hodgepodge of rifles, most being Mausers. And I'm already going to start off disappointing you. I don't actually have in my own collection, for what it's worth, the first version, because they started off working with FN Herstal out of Belgium. FN had a model of the 98 known as the 1924, which was a intermediate length gun. Actually had an intermediate length action that'll become important later, but 23 and quarter inch barrel, overall length of about 43 inches. You get the idea. Standard 7.92 by 57 8mm Mauser cartridge. That would be the first rifle that Yugoslavia would really purchase of note, although not the first one they would actually get. But they would buy them from Belgium from about 1924 up until about 1929, by which time they had contracted production rights to start building their own version of the model 1924 at the Kragujevac arsenal. And the Yugoslavian produced variant would be basically identical to the Belgian, except, well, it was made in Yugoslavia. They'd have Yugoslavian crest and all that. It would usually be known as the M24. So M1924, generally speaking, is an FN-produced version. M24 is the Yugoslavian-produced version. And they would build these really through the 1930s up until the German invasion in 1941. But on the table we have another Mauser they used, the Czechoslovakian, made by the factory we know today, CZ Brno VZ24. This one is not a Yugo. Ironically, I actually do have a Yugo crest one in the store, but it's away right now because I noticed a crack in the rear of the handguard on that one, so it's off at my gunsmith's getting repaired. So, oops, oh well. That's how it goes sometimes. But it's the same rifle. The only difference I noticed is the sling swivel here is slightly different on the Yugo version, because in 1926 they simply bought 40,000 VZ24s that were in Czechoslovakian army stockpiles, which was a new rifle at the time. And it was actually very, very similar to the Belgian M24, not just in terms of the name, but the whole short rifle concept. And yes, I know there were carbines of each, but predominantly we see the short rifle, including a full-length handguard and all that. Again, 8mm, 5-shot, based on the 98, and with a straight bolt handle. That's kind of key for the M24 and the VZ24. And dual sling swivels, side and bottom. The only real difference there, as far as function, the Belgian model was an intermediate length receiver, whereas the Czech model was a full 98 length. There are reasons why Belgium did the intermediate length, but yeah, it's just a little difference that will kind of creep into Yugos. Between 1928 and 1930, give or take, about another 10,000 were acquired from the Czechoslovakians. So they had roughly 55,000 of these in service, kind of supplementing what they had. And these are designated as the M24C in service. And there would be one more major member of the family we can hit the light with and talk about. These videos are fun. This one's starting off great. During the Great War, the Serbians captured a great number of Steyr M95s as they were primarily fighting against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then post-war, as war reparations, between about 1919 and 1921, they received more Steyr M95s from the dissolving Habsburg dynasty, the empire. So they had quite a few of these. Some would be the long rifle, some would be the Stetson carbine, short rifle, but they were chambered for the 8x50 round, which was not a standard. Yugoslavia would issue some of these for second-line troops in training in that cartridge, but they would also rework roughly 122,000 to fire 7.92 by 57 8mm Mauser, and that's what we have here. It's kind of a neat process. The Kragujevac Arsenal would oversee the project nominally, but it would actually be mostly farmed out to subcontractors. And it's pretty neat how they did these, as it was not a simple thing to convert from 8x50 to 8x57. These are still, of course, straight pull guns. I'm going to sit you down for just a second. But because we're going from a rimmed round to a rimless, we have to have a new extractor and bolt face. And the original Steyrs, of course, were fed by Mannlicher on-block clips, which would drop out the bottom. They sealed up the mag, and they actually used a clip inside to make feed lips. And they converted these to be charged by Mauser clips. So pretty major reworking of everything here. The bolt, at least the face of it, the extractor, and the receiver with the stripper clip guide, and of course the magazine as they filled it in and redid that. As for the barrel, they actually fitted these with all new M24 barrels from a Mauser. So you get M24 sights, you get a full-length M24 style handguard. Although we do retain the Steyr barrel band and bayonet lug. And the back part of the stock is still Steyr. What's kind of neat is this gives you a 23.25 inch barrel on a Steyr, which is pretty unique. The original ones really didn't have that. So it's a Steyr intermediate rifle, really only brought to us by Yugoslavia. We notice we still have the same stacking rod. We have the side sling bar and rotating swivel on the bottom. Same here. I think these are really cool conversions, but I wouldn't shoot them today. There are some failure points, especially with the extractor, and spare parts are just impossible to come by. While these did see some frontline use, especially when the Germans invaded in April of '41, they were mostly kept back for reservists and training and just kind of stockpile guns because, they had nothing in them. They were given to them, but they needed to be able to fire the standard cartridge. So it was a neat little interwar project. These were known as the M9524 for obvious reasons. Alternatively, also known as the M95M. So the two names, and I haven't really noticed a difference in, what that means other than just two different names. And again, they were handed out to a few subcontractors. And so those were the rifles primarily Yugoslavia had pre-World War II. And the only number I can really find for M24 Mauser types in service was around 780,000. But, of course, the war changed things. The Germans frankly littered when they went through Europe, leaving a lot of their guns behind, including a lot of Carabiner 98Ks, which suited Yugoslavia just fine. Picked out one of mine here. They pretty much fit the same pattern because they were actually inspired quite a bit by FN and CZs, we'll call it, Bruno's designs with the intermediate, the short rifle system, 8mm, all that. And the reason I wanted to mention this is Yugoslavia finding itself a little short on weapons following World War II. Of course, the communists would take over with Tito and all that. They would put these into service, but many of them were worn out or just needed a bit of standardization. So as early as 1946, they started reworking Kar 98s. And while I don't have one now to show you, I've had them in the past, and they're pretty neat. They look like a standard carabiner. They have a unique front barrel band that's solid. They also have a unique butt plate that's actually made from a sand casting. Some of them would get new stocks, others would keep their same stocks. They would be reblued, but unlike this version here that was hastily reblued by the Soviets, their reblue jobs actually look quite nice. They would also re-serialize, remark the guns, and they would only carry about 4 parts: the receiver/barrel, the bolt, the fuller plate, and the stock. They would mark the stock. They would also add a really cool Yugoslavian crest on top of the receiver. And they would, like I said, they would get a new serial range, typically letter prefix followed by a numerical serial, so on and so forth. A few different depots and arsenals would do these, but the arsenal at Kragujevac would continue it. These would be marked Pritices 44 on the side. You also see TRZ, or just RZ, on a reworked gun. So they're pretty easy to tell apart between the crest, the new serials, maybe a few new parts, and the markings. They're very interesting. Sometimes I wish I kept everything, but when it comes to Mausers, especially when you're in my line of work, if you try to keep every Mauser, you'll drive yourself nuts. But yeah, the first batch of conversions were 46, 47. They were a little more slapdash. After that, 48 into the early 50s, they continued to refurbish Kar 98s, but they seem like they have a little more care and attention taken to them. It's a whole thing, and they would be remarked eventually on the side of the receiver too. Model 98, later M98 or M9848 is sometimes what they're called, because they're trying to make a certain standard. Because they realize, following the war, yeah, they've got a huge hodgepodge in service. So now we can bring out the M48. But first we need to talk about the M2447. And yes, actually I had one in the store that was an old Mitchell's import, but I sold it and shipped it out. Again, they're neat, but can't keep everything. This was their first effort to kind of standardize their M24s. And basically what they would do with the M2447, they would take the original either FN made or what we noted as Zastava, the Kragujevac made guns, and they would give them a new barrel. They would rework the sling swivels, refurbish them as needed, trying to give them a new standard as far as sights and sling arrangements and all that. They would also be fitted with new walnut stocks if needed, but not always, and that was that standard. Now, for the VZ24s they would get a similar rework process. Again, new barrel, new sling arrangements, new stock if needed, and they would be designated as the M2452. And I noticed in the recent years more 52s have appeared on the market than we used to have. So if you're wondering the difference between an M2447 and an M2452, it's the base rifle. They try to make them as common as they could, even using a lot of the same parts. But yeah, there will be some telltales, again, dealing with that different receiver length. I think that's why they definitely gave them different designators, because the 47 and the 52, because of their base rifles, would have a different receiver length. And all this came to be because of our gun here, the M48. I do apologize for not having the earlier Yugo Mausers. Part of it is my interest kind of starts with the communist era. Part of it is you can truly drive yourself mad and poor by trying to collect every single Mauser variant that has come around, because as neat as an M24, M24, 47, M24, 52, and a Yugoslavian reworked K98 are, and I've had them all in my hands at times, they're all large ring 98 style Mausers. They were quite similar. Now, if someone wants to just collect Mausers, that's fine, but, you know, diversity is nice, and by moving some of those along, it allows me to pick up other things. And my M48 was picked up in the excellent to unissued condition from Century years ago. The M95M or M9524 was a kind of a neat little pickup. You don't see them too often, especially in working condition with an intact extractor, so I thought that was worthwhile. But now, as the video goes on, we'll actually have more of the guns we're talking about on screen. So, appreciate your kind of tolerance for this first section. Even though the Germans left quite a few Mausers behind and other guns, Yugoslavia found itself short supplied for its new People's Army, the new Communist Army. For one thing, it was gearing up for a potential war with the evil capitalist West, but also Yugoslavia wasn't a firm member of the Warsaw Pact, as it would become known. Yugoslavia was proudly a member, even a leading member of the Third World. Their position in Cold War history is really fascinating and not simple. And that's because Tito's party made their own communist revolution. Most of them we see in Eastern Europe were started, or at least heavily pushed on, by Stalin's regime. But Tito did it all on his own. That gave him a sense of independence. It also meant that Stalin actually respected him as much as Stalin could respect anyone. So anyway, they needed guns. Reworking K98s, reworking M24s and VZ24s was something. But these are old guns, some of them seeing years of warfare, and they needed work. So they started at the Kragujevac Arsenal, a project to make a new gun, really taking the best features of all their Mausers, but also building them with economics in mind. And that's where the M48 comes from. And this kind of gave a standard for all the others to be built too. It has a full length 23¼ inch barrel, but we have a full upper handguard instead of like a half handguard from a K98. It's very similar barrel bands, similar bayonet lug. Interestingly, the cleaning rod's actually a different shape. Standard rear sights, pretty Yugo crest here, nice bluing. Turned down bolt handle. A lot of the M24 47s retain their straight bolt handles. They wanted to go to a turn down, but they didn't want to cut out the stock like on a K98. So what they did is they stretched the bolt handle out just a bit, and they gave it a flat bottom. Different M48 production runs would have this at different angles, but that gives you the idea. Still enough clearance without having to inlet the stock. They liked it. And then we get to the rear, and the sling swivel style is the same. We have a cupped butt plate, but notice there's no takedown disc, unlike a K98. And like I said, the receiver is a different length. The best way to illustrate that is to compare bolts. Alright, pull them on our rifles, line them up pretty even in the back. To show you the front, it's not a small difference. It's a good almost ½ inch length difference between the original Mauser style, which the VZ24 is, and the FN style here that was carried over to the M48. which is, something worth knowing when you do Yugoslavian Mausers. I think it's neat. I think it's interesting. So they developed this in 1948, set up production for all new Mausers, kind of switching over from the old M24s, and the first contract runs were turned out in 1950. The first production run from 1950 to 1952 was the true M48. All machined parts, no stampings, no castings, very high degree fit and finish, bluing, nice Yugoslavian crest, and they kind of continued their serial patterning, mostly caring about the receiver barrel, the floor plate / trigger guard assembly, the bolt, and the stock. I should also point out, soon we'll start to see a second set of numbers on Yugoslavian produced firearms known as assembly numbers. Typically these have lots of zeros and ones in them, separate from serial numbers themselves. So that was the first run. But in 1952, the M48A would be introduced here, and it would introduce some stamped parts. Starting off kind of mild, they would introduce more over time. Eventually this would become the M48B in 1956. And so you'd have more parts that are stamped, like your trigger guard, your floor plate. I think some late ones might have even had stamped or simplified barrel bands. Memory's failing me right now for sure. One thing I can say though is they did not change the marking from M48 to M48A. They did change it, but they never marked it M48B. So it's a little bit confusing, and it was a bit of an unofficial change. But at any rate, the original M48A was built from 52 to 56, and like the original M48 itself, these were mostly meant for the Yugoslavian People's Army. But with the B model, they started to not only use these themselves, but export them. In fact, there was kind of an export-specific variant known as the M48BO, which stands for no markings. And you can kind of guess why. Same as the M48B, just pretty well scrubbed from the factory, just with the serial number. And these would all be produced kind of concurrently all the way up through 1965. But guns produced in the late 50s and 60s were really meant for export or just reserve or stockpile use. They were kind of falling out of frontline use by this time. How many were built? No one knows for sure, but over 1,220,000 for sure. Quite a large number, but then again they were built by a large factory for 15 years. That means that we're looking at over 2 million Mausers in Yugoslavian service, both during the original Kingdom era and getting into the Communist era. And of course many reworked and rebuilt. But it's a classic Mauser 98 system. These were very well made, and for quite a long time were a great way to get a Cold War era Mauser of good quality to use as a shooter. Some could even be bought in unissued condition. Others more interesting because some of them were used much later on during the Civil War. But before we get into the Communist era, a bit of the modern era, let's go back and check out a pistol. No single pistol design is as closely associated with Serbia, Yugoslavia, than the FN. First the 1910, and then later the 1922. And this is not a Yugoslavian contract one, but I've got a good reason for that. I don't collect 380s. It's just one of those weird things that I've always kind of continued throughout my whole life. Because anything you get in 380, you can also get in 32, and I just like 32, and anyway, I don't collect 380s. So I've got a Nazi version here, occupation version. It'll be a good stand-in because they all come from FN. Yugoslavia did not actually produce these under license, they just bought them under contract from FN. This goes all the way back to the early 20th century and John Moses Browning. His model 1900, 1903s, of course later his 1905, 1911, so he get popular. He had a new innovation. He put the recoil spring around the barrel. Colt in the U.S., who did Browning's guns, was not interested. That left it up to FN, who had handled Browning's European distribution and manufacturing, and they were interested. This would be the smaller version of this, the Model 1910. Same gun, really. Striker fired, always available in 7.65 32 and 9mm Kurz 380 from the outset from FN. The original version was about 6 inches. It held either 6 or 7 cartridges in the grip, depending on. And actually, the Kingdom of Serbia was one of the earliest folks to give a contract. In 1913, they ordered roughly 250. So a small contract, but it kind of got the line going, and FN would sell them commercially in the military and the police. I even once had a Japanese marked 1910. Kind of one of those guns I wish I'd kept because it had the cool Tokyo symbol, but it was kind of rough shape, so you know how it goes. But, anywho, of course, the 1910 is also famous in Serbian hands because of the assassination of the Archduke in 1914, thus kicking off World War I. Nevertheless, Serbian forces would continue to equip themselves with the 1910 throughout the First World War, and that would carry over into the post-war, the interwar period. At the time, the young new nation, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, needed a military, and for that matter, police sidearm, but, they needed it on a budget, so using pre-existing tooling was a good idea. So they started working with FN around 1921 to update the 1910 to be a more military-specific version, and that's actually what FN considered the Model 1922, sometimes called the Model 1910-22. This was considered the military police version, and it was not readily sold for commercial purposes, especially during this era. So the changes were pretty straightforward. For one, they kept the 9mm Kurz, the 9x17, the 380 chambering for Yugoslavia. They extended the barrel out, but to kind of keep everything the same, they did it in a very clever, simple, economical way. They kept the same slide, they just made a collar with a latch out here, and they moved the front sight out further. The barrel went from being roughly 3.5 inches to 4.5. It did give a longer sight radius. But from there, they also extended the grip from 6 shots in 380, or 7 in 32, to 8 shots, or 9 in, I've said 32, I do apologize, 380, down to 32. You know what I mean. Longer grip, 2 extra rounds, either way you look at it. Everything else pretty much stayed the same, although the Yugoslavian guns often did have a lanyard loop here, and they had the original black synthetic grips. The wartime guns would start out with those, but they would go to wood. It also was quite a safe carry gun. It had a grip safety, it had a manual safety, and it had a magazine disconnect safety where it could not be pulled if the magazine was out. And, of course, it had a really spiffy Yugoslavian crest on top as well. And by the end of 1922, the design changes, updates were finished at FN. They were approved by Yugoslavia. And then the next year, an initial order for 60,000 handguns was placed, and deliveries would start shortly thereafter because, again, not a whole lot of retooling had to happen. And they would continue producing these concurrently with the 1910. And they would, like I said, eventually they would introduce a 32 version. But this started off as a 380 because the whole 1922 design started off for Yugoslavia. They would continue to receive these pistols throughout the 1930s, really up until the German occupation of the FN factory in Belgium. And then the Germans would actually seize some pistols destined for Yugoslavia. They weren't happy about it. They didn't like grabbing 380s. They preferred 32s themselves because it was just more standard. But they would actually see quite a bit of use with the Luftwaffe. And so that kind of cut Yugoslavia off from more pistols. Plus, of course, the war drained them, the occupation by the Nazis. So you do start to see fewer and fewer in service by the 1945 and the beginning of the communist era. But yeah, several were still around and used by Tito's forces, because this was a common gun, and both the 1910 and the 1922 have a direct connection to Serbia, Yugoslavia, and I think that's neat. So we will sprinkle pistols throughout this video, even though we're mostly going to focus on rifles. And that actually seems like a good way to pivot into something that fires a pistol cartridge, but is much larger. Up to this point, influences have pretty much been from Western Europe, but of course Serbia, later Yugoslavia, had a strong connection to, well, Russia. It's in the name, Slav. And here we have the first example of a post-communism takeover influence gun in the form of the M49, later M5957. Now this is often mistaken for a PPSH-41, a Papa Shah copy, but it's not. But it was very clearly inspired by that gun. For example, it fires the same 7.62x25 Tokarev cartridge, and this would be the first, Russian cartridge we see in widespread Yugoslavian service. And it even feeds from the same magazines. While this could actually accept the 71-round drum from the PPSH, Yugoslavia, Zastava as it would soon be known, only made 35-round stick mags, but they were the same double stack single feed pattern. Actually, a lot of the influences on this don't come from the PPSH beyond that, though. Looking at the stock, the shape is actually very similar to the M48, including the cupped butt plate, but this does have a storage compartment like a PPSH in the stock, but lots of guns have those. But the butt plate and even stock shape definitely remind me of the Mauser. But then this kind of overall look is more reminiscent of the Italian Beretta MAB 38. Even the switch here, the safety, is actually seen on some later production 38s. I think it's a 3849. We do have a PPSH style mode selector here, but then the safety's here. And whereas the PPSH used a lot of stamped or sheet steel, this is all machined. The tube is actually just a simple metal tubing, kind of like what Sten guns used. And it's one piece with the barrel shroud, ventilated. And it does have removable barrel, unlike the PPSH. And back here we have the disassembly. The only major difference between the 49 and the 4957 is the recoil assembly. The 49 had more of a Beretta style captive, and the 57 had more of a free-floating, larger spring system, really just to ease production. By the way, the mag catch is pretty PPSH pattern, even folding. And these had a nice blued finish. Here's the magazine out of it. Standard 35 rounds. Again, single feed, which will become important in a minute. 2-position flip rear sight, simple notch. These are typically rated out to about 200 meters. And we do have a nice Yugoslavian crest on the receiver. Relatively high quality gun, all things considered. It is about 34 inches long. Of course, this is a semi-automatic civilian legal version, so we do have an extended barrel slightly. The original barrel is just over 10.5 inches. And weight isn't too bad, at about 8 1/4 to 8 1/3 pounds unloaded. Again, probably looks heavier than it actually is. Zastava really started work on this in 1949, hence the name, but it wasn't put into production until 1951 and would soon enter service, and then production would slightly ramp up with the introduction of the 1957 model. But frankly, this was a starting point. times were changing. Fixed stock guns of this style were quickly falling out of favor as mechanized armor would increase and the Cold War would progress from World War II styling. So these are produced in relatively limited numbers by Zastava. I don't know how many, unfortunately, but just a few tens of thousands. And production seems to have wrapped up by the early 60s. And really by that time, these had already been taken out of frontline service and more or less retired to the reserves, training, or, guard duty. Guns like this are really good for that. Notice the fixed charging handle here. It is reciprocating, unlike with the Beretta. And of course this would normally fire from an open bolt, ejecting to the left. It actually had a slightly slower cyclic rate than a PPSH because this receiver is longer and the recoil mechanism is different. But because it was firing the 7.62x25 cartridge, it was pretty punchy. But it was only the beginning. This is really when we start to see influences. But they weren't quite done with German yet. German discotheque mode. This light's been bringing the cats in all day. Good times. We next move to Zastava's M56. Work began around 1954 on this design, and it was really put into production by 1959 and in service by 1961, and would be produced on and off all the way into the 1970s. Some sources say they did not turn out their final ones until 1975. And it's said that about 89,000 were built in total. And at first this might appear like an MP40 of German influence, but it's really not. It's really its own thing. Kind of what they did up here. But this is showing the need for a more compact and honestly cheaper to produce weapon. This still fires 7.62x25 Tokarev, but it actually gives it better range and penetration than an MP40 firing 9x19 Luger Parabellum. We have a nearly 10-inch barrel. It's like 9 3/4 inches. Overall length with our underfolding stock underfolded is about 23.5 inches, and if we were to deploy it, which we can't do on this one because it's a pistol, it's actually the same overall length of just over 34 inches like our M49 up here. It is lighter though. It's about 6.5 pounds unloaded, so nearly 2 pounds lighter. And that's because it does use more stampings and synthetics compared with our earlier gun. And it's simplified in a lot of ways. And it uses 32 round box mags, which are different from the 49. And there's a good reason for that. Again, borrowed from the PPSH 41, these are double stack single feed. Not known for giving the best reliability. And the MP40s were single stack single feed as well. The 56 mags are double stack, double feed. So not only an improvement on the PPSH 41 mags, but also the MP40 for that matter. And they have reinforced top. And Russia did something similar when they went to PPS 42 and PPS 43. They wanted a double feed mag, and so they had to go to a new mag pattern. The flip side is this would not be able to take a drum because it has a mag well. But then again, Yugoslavia never really made drums. By the way, the mag catch is actually behind the mag well, so not on the side as on an MP40. Another kind of cool feature, this has a bayonet lug. Also has a hooded front sight. We've got a nut on the barrel for removing. We've got a cocking handle that actually can rotate to work as a safety. We have a flip rear sight. Synthetic grips. These did actually have a fire mode selector and a safety, so you could set single or automatic fire and there was a manual safety besides. And even though it generally comes apart the same as an MP40, it doesn't have the button on the bottom. You actually just push the end cap on the back and there's a button. And flipping it over, this is of course another semi-automatic closed bolt adaptation. Unlike this one where we extended the barrel to keep the functioning stock, this one has the stock but it's pinned closed. There's your takedown button. Sling loops. Yeah, this does actually have the original barrel for what it's worth. These were more successful and more popular. Simplified. They weren't perfect. They had some faults, but they were a lot simpler to make than an MP40, which itself was a simplified MP38. For example, a much simpler recoil spring system. We had a longer receiver, and again, improved controls for select fire mechanisms. And who doesn't like a bayonet lug? But yeah, these were produced throughout the 60s and into the 70s, and were primarily used by the Yugoslavian People's Army. Neither of these were massive exports for Yugoslavia, for Zastava, but they were exported, especially the M56, in some numbers. Places in South America, including also they would go to Asia with Vietnam and a few others. You can look up the list if you're interested, but they were limited export, but mostly meant for them, and it's showing their use of the 7.62 Tokarev cartridge. And interesting subguns. Looks like a PPSH. It really is more of a take on a Beretta. Looks like an MP40, but really it's kind of its own thing. But they are firing the Soviet cartridge, and if the submachine gun is firing the cartridge, well, we will need a pistol too, right? These semi-autos, of course, were done by MK Gun Mods, later Mac Arms. I had found this 4957 kit locally. It had actually been made into a display gun, but it does have the original receiver sections. This M56, I talked a couple of years ago about trying to get one to run. It was a pain in the ass. In fact, 2 different builders tried gun builds, did a striker system, eventually had to go, well, we tried striker and hammer both, and yeah, it's just sometimes they do and sometimes they don't work out. These kits were kind of a hit or miss thing. They were in well-used condition some of the time. They had original barrels, but some of the barrels had so much erosion in the throat that they really weren't usable. But luckily, only 1 or 2 barrels were just completely unserviceable. But that's what you get when you get the Yugoslavian surplus stuff. Their guns saw service. These are kind of interesting footnotes in machine gun, or submachine gun rather, history. Can't say they're my favorites overall, but because I wasn't really looking forward to them, that sounds bad, I know, but because I wasn't, and they just kind of came out of nowhere, I was suitably impressed. It's kind of neat. I do have a bayonet for this one somewhere, but I didn't run across it while doing this video, and it was already my afternoon, so with that, we're gonna move right along and talk about the little counterpart to these. Once very uncommon in the USA, I'm happy to say that today the Zastava M57 is, well, quite common, and that's great because it's an interesting Tokarev variant. It's actually one of the most radical variants, considering most countries just copied a TT-33. Zastava didn't do just that, and this really sets a precedent going forward. But this is one of their earliest Soviet-Russian design inspirations. So kind of going back to the model 1922 pistol, which was the pre-war service gun, this was the post-war service gun. We do have a little gap in there, but yeah. Now, I want to point out, this, like I said, has roughly a 7-inch overall length with a 4.5-inch barrel, and it weighs about 25 ounces. Going to this, lengthwise, we're about the same. We're about 7.5 inches, a little bit bigger. And we have about the same barrel length, just over 4.5 inches. But of course, we're firing the 7.62 25 Tokarev cartridge versus 32, or in the case of Yugoslavia, 380. So you're definitely getting a power bump. Whereas this is just a direct blowback striker-fired gun. This is a Browning-style link locked breech hammer gun, and it is single action only. So yeah, it's heavier at about 32 ounces unloaded. And yeah, at first this might look like a standard Tokarev TT-33, but it's not. Zastava unveiled its first prototypes in 1957. Most sources say this was a licensed copy of a Russian Tokarev. I guess so. Although, as we'll see, they didn't always let that hold them back if they didn't have a license. And they would start to put it into production in 1960, and by 1963 it was becoming quite common in the field with the Yugoslavian army. Now, the biggest difference everyone knows about is a longer grip. Not a lot longer, but your regular Tokarev has an 8-round magazine. This has a 9-round, so a total capacity of 10. Longer mag, longer grip, meaning regular Tokarev mags will not fit. These mags also have the old school style lanyard loop on the bottom, something that Russian Tokarevs did away with at the end of World War II. And of course the grip panels will be different. We still have a star, but we have Yugoslavian markings within the star. We have the late style small serrations, but we have a difference in the mag catch. This is a dished in a concave catch, whereas a Russian is a smaller and convex catch. This is actually much easier to use. The sights are also easier to use. Flipping it up, we see a cool Yugoslavian crest on top. That's neat. We also see a better sight picture. There's actually some serrations on the top of the slide to kind of cut down on glare. And we do have a dovetail sight for adjustment. Kind of neat. And one other key difference, we have a captive recoil spring underneath the barrel, making disassembly a little easier. And one other difference. Like I said, this is a single action only, with the only safety being the half cock, except for one other. If we pour our mag out, hammer cock back, we will not be able to pull the trigger. It does have a magazine disconnect safety. A feature that was actually carried over from the model 1922, which makes a lot of sense. And that's not something you typically see in a Tokarev. So yeah, this really was its own thing in a lot of small but really cool ways. To import into the US, a few different safety systems have been done. Most recently a dingus on the trigger, which is easily put to rights. The older imports brought in around 2005 had a 1911 style safety back here. This was the standard sidearm in the Yugoslavian army all the way through to the end of that nation, the disillusionment in the 1990s. That said, quite interestingly, Zastava still makes the M57 today, or rather an updated 21st century version known as the M57A. Has a few different things for modern production. It also has a manual safety installed and fitted at the factory, so it actually works better. The downside is the M57A is not CNR eligible here because it is not surplus and is not 50 years old. But older guns like this can be, because they are surplus guns. And of course they had to be import marked somewhere, but that's a small price to pay when we couldn't get them before. I think it's really neat, and this is just, yeah, your standard Yugoslavian sidearm. But this is not their last Tokarev variant. We'll get there, but first, let's return to rifles. I know most people are tuning into this video because they want to hear about Yugoslavian Zastava AKs, and we're getting there with this one. They're a variant of the venerable Simonov SKS. So, we're getting there real soon. In the 1950s, while we had some submachine guns, mostly the Yugoslavian army was equipped on the front line with Mausers, M48s, M24, 47s, and the like. They needed a new weapon. Times are changing. It was still acceptable to have bolt actions in the early 50s, but post-Korean War, semi-autos or even select fires were becoming a thing. Likewise, Russia, well, they developed the SKS, and while they did export to several nations, and they did get a few nations like Romania and China to build it under license, many nations chose not to. Poland was a good example of someone who just decided there was no room, there was no reason for this gun. By 1957-58, Russia realized that this production line was outdated, obsolete. So they graciously, in an attempt to kind of, gain closer ties with Yugoslavia, gave the nation the SKS production line. Now, you would think maybe communism, they just shared everything. Oh no, Russia sold licensing or otherwise got things that they wanted from nations to build these. So, just to give it to Yugoslavia was an attempt to get closer. And this would have been post-Stalin into the new Khrushchev era. And this kind of fit their needs. It was able to be produced at Pirozzi 44, Enterprise 44, soon Krena Zastava, that same factory that's been building all this. You get the old machining and everything. It was well suited to their tooling. So in 1959 they adopted it. And in 1960 they were setting up the production line. And they did their first small batch run of a few hundred in 1961. This would be the first time they would also use its 7.62 by 39 M43 cartridge. But full production of the M59 would have to wait until 1964. But then when they did produce it, they put it into rather large scale. Between that time and 1967, they built roughly 50,000 of these. So okay, not a huge number, but not tiny either. And what they built was almost an exact copy, one of the few times they did that, of a late production Soviet Tula SKS 45, with one major difference. Specs were the same, 20.5-inch barrel, although early on there were some slightly longer barrel test models made, I will admit, but they weren't in standard production. Blued finish, kind of the more matte blue, like a late Russian. Same 10-round fixed mag, same charger system, same safety. That all seems the same. Now, one thing I will mention is the wood. There was a long-standing myth that Zastava SKSs had teak wood. Not true. The early ones could have walnut, just like some other Mausers, like the 24-47s could be walnut, but these Mausers were mostly built with beech wood and elm wood. And that would continue on to the SKS, especially as time would go on. So you're looking at a kind of a heavy beech, heavy elm wood. Some say birch was used later on too. Russia used some birch. So several different types of wood, for sure, but not teak wood. Just thought I'd point that out. So the difference. Well, we can kind of tell it by the folding bayonet. This may not come across on camera, but in person you can definitely feel it. It's a much more matte finish. This is not a plated bayonet, whereas your Russian ones, at least before refire, bore. And that corresponds to the fact that even though this is a cold hammer forged barrel, it is not chrome lined. And this will continue with Zastava guns, especially in this cartridge, this caliber, for a very long time. And it was often speculated that Yugoslavia did not have chromium deposits. This does not seem to be the reason or case. because Macedonia and Kosovo have and had at the time chromium mines. In fact, if you go back and look, at various points in history, they even exported chromium. So they obviously had enough to export and chose not to use it in their rifles. At least not, again, for this caliber. Why is that? No one knows for sure. I will point out a couple of things. Whereas Russian ammunition was often steel-cased, Yugoslavian ammunition was often brass. Maybe that had something to do with it. Also, when you chrome a bore, you do have to make it slightly larger to leave room for the chrome layer. And of course, a layer like that added will not ever be perfect. Meaning that while chrome is amazing for cleaning and even keeping your barrel grooves, your rifling sharper or longer, it does slightly, and I do mean slightly, negatively impact accuracy if you're trying to go for a tight bore. Because you kind of by necessity have to leave the bore a little loose for the chrome layer. Was that a reason? Honestly, guys, I don't know. I just wanted to share that with you. But anyway, let's get back to the Yugoslavian M59 SKS. Or as the soldiers nicknamed it, the Papavka, because PAP M59 is its full name, and basically that translates to self-loading rifle or semi-automatic rifle, PAP. Kind of interesting that they keep that name today with a lot of their semi-auto imports. Anyway, they built about 50,000 of these between 64 and 67, and they were able to go into frontline use. But, of course, this version here, that looks a lot like a Russian, isn't the Zastava SKS we all know and love. This is the version we know and love. The PAP M59-66. With an extended barrel, roughly 22 inches. Actually very similar to those early test guns, but with the difference of having not a Russian necessarily spec grenade launcher, but a NATO spec 22 mil. And there's actually 3 variations of grenade launcher, just minor production changes. And to work with it, we had to redo the bayonet. Instead of having the full ring, we had to have this lip that locks in. See how it goes? And they did extend the bayonet from the original to partially make up for that, so it still sticks out a decent amount. Back here, of course, we have an altered gas block. We've got a gas cutoff switch, so manual cutoff. And then, of course, we can raise our sights. You know the deal, I bet. If not, I've done several videos in the past. So, new gas block, new front sight arrangement. And you get to the back, and it's pretty well standard until you get to the rubber recoil butt plate. Although they still left the trapdoor for a cleaning kit in it, which is kind of cool. And this, too, again, does not have a chrome-lined bore. And the rifle part itself is still 20.5 inches. So this is by far our longest and heaviest SKS variant. The butt plate adds on a good bit, and of course the launcher does, getting us to 44, 45 inches versus 40, 41 here. Adding on a couple of pounds besides. Typical sling that we'll see going forward quite a bit. This has the more matte wood versus this one. It also has the non-polished bolt carrier. And this, as I mentioned earlier, we have both serial numbers and assembly numbers when we get to the Zastava SKSs. Main production, at least for the Yugoslavian army, would last through 1970, with roughly 165,000 built. The thing is, I think that number might also include the earlier 59s, based on total production, stated to be around 252,000. Either way, the roughly other 100,000 were produced for export. And so this would have been one of the first Zastava guns that they actively sought an export market for. I think that's interesting. And so it's hard to say when production really ended. They would do small batches throughout the 70s, and they would take in and refurbish older guns all the way through up at least 1989. And there would be one other variant, which this one actually is, the M5966A1, which had flip-up night sights. And flip down back here. Over time, some would have phosphorescent paint, others would have tritium vials. So we actually shoot at least 2 different types of night sight, and I believe there are at least a couple of sub-variants even in there. So different styles of night sights, but either painted on or tritium vial. Worth pointing out. By the 80s, these were, of course, in second-line service, maybe police use, guard duty. The SKS looks pretty sharp as a guard rifle, training, but they were used, somewhat tragically at times, during the Yugoslavian Civil War, because a lot of ethnic cleansing squads had the M5966, because, well, they didn't need an automatic rifle for that. It's also worth pointing out this is where we start to see the Yugoslavian mentality of every infantryman being a grenadier, which would, in theory, allow just your average Joe with an average rifle to take on an armored vehicle, in theory. Which kind of gives a punching above your weight class feel to the thing. And it was really with that, with the 5966, that finally let us retire our venerable old Mausers, again, at least from frontline service, and we'll see that their production ended, like I said, in 65, which is right after full production of the M59 started and right before the 66. Neat guns, covered them in more detail in the SKS video, but definitely recognizable for Zastava. Now, well, we can finally get to what everyone came here for. Yugoslavian SKSs are quite neat, and they started to really appear in America around 2003, 2004 en masse. Before that, they weren't that common. The M59 is a very standard SKS variant, but it's pretty rare here. This one came in from the Century, listed as excellent condition. And the only real variation we saw in these batches was the kind of type of wood. But the 5966s we've had in all kinds of condition, from well worn to unissued, like this one. And I picked this one up in early 2004 because it was a unique SKS variant. Before that, most of them we had were pretty similar with the blade style, the Romanian, the Russian, the early Chinese. The later spike Chinese gave a little variation. The Albanians were kind of interesting, but always kind of few and far between themselves. Yeah, but having a grenade launcher on it was neat. And keep in mind, this was still during the assault weapons ban. These were illegal because they didn't have enough features, and they were considered CNR anyway, so it didn't matter. So it was kind of neat to have a grenade launcher on a rifle back then. An attractive point. Unfortunately, also back then, and for years before, people treated SKSs like bastard AKs and weren't necessarily all that kind to them. Hello, kitty. Anyway, I have tested your patience long enough. It's time to move on to the main attraction. And we're finally here. In the mid-60s, the SKS was coming online, and 2 submachine guns were in production. But times were changing. The submachine gun was good for what it was, but the 760x25 Tokarev cartridge still had limited range compared to a rifle round and limited penetration. And the SKS, well, it made up for that with longer range and better penetration, and later versions could even launch rifle grenades. It was a fixed 10-shot mag and self-loading. It was a PAP after all. So there's inherent limitations in that. It's also quite long and heavy. Therefore, even as they were setting up the M59 production line, designers at Zastava, under government auspices, started trying to acquire Russian AKs, AK Type 3s. At first they just got a couple, they studied them, but it wasn't really enough to design after. Then they got more, and in 1961, right as they were doing the first test batch of SKSs, they started looking into how to reverse engineer the Kalashnikov, the original AK Type 3. But they did not want to just copy it. They wanted to customize and improve it to their own needs. And they did not have a license to do it, and they didn't give a flip. While the Kalashnikov would have to wait to be adopted until 1970 as the AP M70 for automatic rifle, 1970, the story actually goes back to what we refer to in the USA as the M64. And those who know me kind of know why I picked up this gun recently, and probably understand my inspiration for doing this here video. So we're going to set this one aside for a minute and talk about this one in the early days. Recently I did a preview video on this rifle here, but for right now let's ignore the front end and just talk about the back end, because this is what the original M64 prototypes and even kind of pre-production models look like, because they did make quite a few of these. They started with the milled receiver from the AK Type 3, but they changed it up quite a bit. They simplified it, for one thing, but they also gave it this very interesting shape on the side, and that was to work with an internal automatic last round bolt hold open device. Here's an original mag. We talked about these in the last video. This little notch let the follower come up and trip the device, and it would essentially teeter-totter and put the bolt in the back, and you could pull the mag out and have your bolt back. This is something the Yugoslavians wanted. Early on, it still had a top and bottom tang, one screw on top, two on bottom, with the rubber recoil pad. It should have a sling swivel here. To be fair, the owner of Southern Tactical did respond saying that they noticed the receivers didn't have the cutout from Tortort. It does have a retaining button in the back. That would have been for the grenade launcher, because they were still keeping that feature. And of course they would go to the extended handguards. These features were all early on seen, including the unique pistol grip. This rifle actually has the early style grip with the metal ferrule on top. A lot of neat features, including a very heavy duty top cover. Again, very unique receiver. And from the beginning they were thinking night sights as well. The M64s, and yes, M65s, we'll get there, had lots of variations and experiments, and they were produced, but they were never named as such, aside from like the earliest prototypes. They were usually just row marked with the Zastava, the Krena Zastava logo, and would go into field testing. And really the version that was destined for service began to develop it in 1968 in testing, and then yes, was finally adopted in 1970, and that's what we have here. The final version had several changes to the receiver. That bolt hold open device seemed like a good idea in theory, but in practice it meant that standard Kalashnikov mags made elsewhere would not fit, although their mags would fit those guns. So instead they went to the manual hold open follower we know today. Not perfect, but at least it did hold open on the final round. It's something. That actually meant that this side of the receiver changed. Now, early M70s still had some of the more ornate machining, like this lip up here, but there'd be kind of an early and a late M70 receiver, and eventually we could just go to a slab side. This is actually a re-welded receiver, so yeah. And they got rid of the bolt hold open device, so this kind of went away. More importantly, they changed the rear. The tangs went away, and we went to this bolt system. A bolt all the way through the stock, connecting into a socket back here. We still have the spring-loaded button to retain things. The extended handguards that are easy to tell apart because of the slots. And while the earliest versions still retained the screw-in barrel to the receiver. Very quickly with the M70, some call them the M70B, some just call them M70, they went to an AKM style press and pinned in barrel. But it's still in a milled receiver, and it's still the medium heavy profile borrowed from the original AK Type 3. Flipping these over, notice that the right side lightning cut was retained. Even though this is a US made receiver, they did a good job of keeping the original style lightning cut. Again, this one is a original part. Non-lightning cut carrier. Except for in the press and pin barrel, it's pretty similar. Of course, like I said, we have our grenade sight, cleaning rod under the barrel. It takes an AKM bayonet instead of the original AK, cleaning rod under the barrel. We do have 14mm threads with the muzzle nut typically, and we do have folding night sights. Much like with the SKS, some would have phosphorescent paint, and some would have tritium vials. Slab handguards besides. And again, early machined parts. And these would actually be in service. Really, when you talk about the original M70, it's all a mix of a lot of things. And here's a standard mag pouch. 2 medium pockets in front, and then room for 4 mags in back. And there's all kinds of small variations in these pouches, all kinds. But generally they follow this pattern: belt straps and a shoulder strap, kind of made out of this interesting material. What have you. Oops. And a metal buckle, as you heard. So, that was the original milled M70. It's interesting that they were producing a milled rifle in the 1970s, but it wouldn't last long, and the infantry rifle would end up needing a big brother. From the very beginning of design development with the M64s, underfolding stocks were trialed out. Such rifles usually had an A suffix added, like M64A. And those early underfolding stocks weren't so much inspired by the Russian AKS or AKMS, but rather, well, their own M56 here, which of course itself was inspired by the MP40. But of course they would get away from that as time would go on. They also needed to reduce cost and weight. The original rifles were 9 pounds, and a machined receiver in the 70s, well, stamping was the name of the game at that time. The original milled M70 adopted would have an underfolding stock, sometimes called the M70AB, but that was milled. Next, they would go to a 1.0mm receiver. I know some today like to say 0.9, but it's actually a 1mm with tolerances allowing 0.9 to 1.1. This is standard. Either way, more of an AKM type receiver, and with an underfolding stock. This would be lighter, cheaper, faster to produce, and was known M70AB1. So the milled was the M70AB. This would be with the thin receiver M70AB1. Of course, this is a PAP NPAP import underfolding stock. I've got it open on the mag here, and would have had a grenade sight originally, handguards, and style stock. Still blued finish. Still took the standard mags. And here it is, stock folded up. Much more compact, more in line with the submachine gun. In fact, this is really what spelled the end for the M49, 57, and the M56. You have a gun here, not any real heavier or longer, but firing a much more effective cartridge. Slightly longer barrel, of course, but you know. So, this was the underfolder. There were plans to have a 1mm stamped receiver fixed stock, intended to be the M70B1. But anyone who knows Yugoslavian guns knows that's not what the M70B1 is. This is where the names kind of get convoluted, but, we're well into production now. So, this is the M70B1 we're familiar with, or rather, my OPAP dressed up as one. They tried the 1mm receiver, but considering they were using their rifles to launch grenades and other heavy-duty things, they would soon go to the 1.5. Again, some people like to say 1.6 because it makes it sound just that much bigger. Technically, yeah, that's within spec, but, that's kind of that range, 1.5 to 1.6 millimeter. But it didn't stop there. They also went to a much beefier, heavier, bulged front trunnion. The barrel stayed the same medium-heavy profile thickness. In fact, the front end doesn't change at all. But, yeah, they beefed it up here as well. Ironically, because of the heavy receiver and trunnion, the stamped M70B1 weighs essentially the same as the milled M70. The difference is minuscule, while the 1mm is a little bit lighter, but still not as light as an AKM because we still have the heavier profile barrel. I should also mention the top covers. They stay smooth, but they do get slightly thinner. I think they go from roughly 1.5mm down to about 1, but they still stay the smooth. The takedown in the back is the same. Stock is the same. Handguards, night sights remain. While most of your Zastava guns will have a simple nut, some late ones could have the sugar scoop brake. Still take the AKM. And of course, still have the grenade sights. The early pattern are a little different. The way the gas block is machined, and of course you do have a ported gas tube. The later style, the ports are on the gas block, and the machining is a little different. Speaking of the grenade sights, to make ready to launch a grenade, you simply screw off the nut or brake that's on, and then screw down this attachment, which is typically carried in a belt pouch. And here's the 5966 SKS. Ironically, once you do this, the two are almost the same length. SKS is still a little longer, so you do have to attach that. But then you just flip up your sights, and you're good to go. The gas cutoff works automatically, whereas on the SKS, you do have to manually flip the switch and then flip this up. But of course, you can't flip it up unless you do the switch. So, a little more convoluted on the SKS. This is a little more foolproof, but then again, you'd have to put on the attachment. Just holds on with the detent. Pretty neat. And just kind of goes to show you the mentality they had. So this would have been used by second line troops, training reservists, and after the mid-70s, this became more and more common with the 1.5 stamped receiver and bulged front trunnion. Hope it doesn't seem like I'm trying to rush through the Kalashnikovs or the APs in this series. I definitely am not. It's just that these are topics that I have discussed in multiple videos, including recently in that giant AK one. But of course we have to talk about them. This milled is a re-weld done many years ago, back when the kits were cheap. Of course, this is my OPAP. We've seen many times. These were once kind of overlooked, but now rather appreciated. Although, of course, we have the Z-PAPs now, and they have chrome line bores, which for a shooter is a better thing. But for a collector, I still want the non-chromed. And the old N-PAPs, they kind of got a bit of a bad rap, but I've always found the underfolding variants a good shake. I've had this one. It's my second one. Both of them held up well, and no problems with it. Plus, I think if you're going to have a Yugo collection, you do need at least one of the 1mm receiver versions, and it does seem like it was the underfolders that actually saw production and use. Whereas when you go to the fixed stocks, it's the 1.5s. Century, of course, built quite a few M70 AB2 Sporters. I bought my first one in 2005 right after the ban came off. That's the one that the UPS truck ran over, and the box looked like an accordion. So I had to send it back and then wait a few more months until they made another batch. So that was great. They have, of course, produced quite a few AB2s over the years. US barrels, US receivers. Fun fact, when they started building them, it was before the barrel ban. So the reason they use US barrels is so many of the Yugoslavian original barrels were just dart bores or even worn out rifling and crowns, and they didn't want people complaining. The M70B1s, they always produced in smaller numbers, and they were always a little more expensive. So when the OPAPs came out, that was a good shake. But they really are quite cool, and it's much like their SKSs. It's them doing their own things. But the grenade sights are quite iconic. I should point out too, though, even over in Serbia today, the civilian versions have this style of gas block without the grenade, without the bayonet lug. So it is a factory thing done over there for semi-automatic PAPs. With that, let's kind of compare receivers and move along. So here are the three main production receivers lined up. Yes, we had the M64 pattern, but and they did see service, but the M70 without the bolt hole open was really the first style. The 1mm never was produced in a fixed stock, at least not for the military in Yugoslavia outside of trials. I think it's just because they expected to launch grenades and reliability, dependability. But they would make the M70 AB1 in significant numbers with the lighter stock, lighter receiver, because you can think that, saving weight with the trunnion and receiver would matter for vehicle, airborne, there is some sense there. And you probably just wouldn't want to launch grenades with it. And of course the M70 AB2 would be this version, but with this stock. So, see quite a few M70 AB2s as well. And of course there are underfolding milds is the M70A or M70AB. Again, we're kind of just going nominal here. And the magazines pretty much just remained your steel 30-rounder. There are minor variations in production years, but really the same. And they always had a blued finish. Markings on the trunnion would sometimes have the year and the model, sometimes just have Zastava, banner, a mix. Markings changed over time throughout the 70s and 80s. And both the underfolding and the fixed stock would be standard issue. And they would keep older molds around until they wore out, sometimes giving them away or selling them. They sold quite a few of these, not just to the People's Army, but to friendly nations. And these were the rifles that served all the way until the end of Yugoslavia. But, as I said earlier, of course we have the big brother. Now we come to something we recently discussed in that previous video, the M72 series of handheld light machine guns. Although they started off, at least in the prototype form, is the M65. Yes, I know these are marked as M64. The reality is that's because Tortort does these receivers for either one, because that's how Zastava did them. Whereas the RPK and the AKM have quite a few differences even back here. They were keeping the rear section the same between the rifle and the light machine gun. The differences only began with the barrel and the rear sight. But yeah, the original prototypes, which would have had the bolt hole open, would have been the M65. There was the M65A with an underfolding stock. And there was even a variant, I've seen sometimes called the M65B, but I don't know that it was ever really named that had a quick change barrel. Because one of the issues with the RPK was overheating of the barrel. But much like the bolt hole open, that did not go anywhere. Instead, I think one of the ways they kept the barrel cool was a relatively low rate of fire of about 600 to 620 RPM. Keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, Yugoslavia used a slightly different version of 7.62 by 39, the Russian version known as M43, but the Yugoslavian version was known as M67 and had a brass case. So yeah, having a relatively low rate of fire helped. Also, using the standard 30-round mag helped. Yes, there were 40s and even 75-round drums appear, but not as frequently as just the 30 with these. So, yeah, this one here, it has a standard looking stock, but it has the tangs. Probably shouldn't have the retention thing in the back since these did not launch grenades, but again, the same receiver. From what we looked at in the last video, this gas block and gas tube do seem correct for an M65 type. And then we have this heavy barrel. It's heavy throughout, even getting heavier here with these fins. And it's about 21 3/4 inches, so basically 22 inches versus the 16 1/4 on a regular rifle and a medium profile. So about 5.5 inches longer overall, giving it a longer overall length. The regular rifle around 35 inches, and the LMG being about 40.5 inches. I'm just rounding here for you. As far as weights, again, it's hard to say on the rifles because there's so many different variants, but these were around 8 1/4 pounds, and these were around 12 pounds or just slightly more. Goes to show you. And of course, we had our light bipod and 24mm threads, and they would go to this style of receiver. And this would initially be adopted on a milled receiver as the M72, with the M72A being the underfolding variant. So again, kind of keeping commonality with this here. But that's not the version you're probably most familiar with. That would be this version here, the M72B1. This is on the same 1.5mm stamped receiver as the M70B1, with the same bulged front trunnion. So again, commonality in the back. The only difference, since these did not launch grenades, there's not a pin in the back, even though since they use the same top covers, there's a little half moon cut out for it. But otherwise, same stock, rubber recoil pad, same pistol grip, and this was a complete original kit, just on a US receiver. When they went to the stamped receiver, they did give lightning cuts to the bolt and carrier, just as on the other. But the barrels pretty much stayed the same with this heavy profile. Notice that there's no additional cleaning rod retaining past that. And really the bipod doesn't change much. And again, we have the windage adjustable rear sight. As we talked about in the previous video, we have the front flip night. And on a standard M70, you have a rear flip, but since this one has a windage and elevation adjustable rear sight, if you want a night sight, it's actually a clip-on affair, as someone pointed out in the comments. So, wanted to mention that. No provision for bayonet, of course. Now, I do want to point out a couple of interesting factoids that really do make this even more different from an RPK than first might appear. Obviously, these don't use the clubfoot stock, and if you might think, oh, it's an RPK receiver, but considering both of these receivers are used on the standard rifle, that's kind of a moot point. Yes, the rear sight is very RPK, but the barrel profile is very, very different, and about an inch shorter. And of course, we have these ribs, which make the barrel very heavy here, and that gives cooling. And because of that, we actually have short handguards. We're used to thinking of Yugoslavian guns as having extended handguards because of the M70, and compared to a Russian AKM, they do. But actually, these handguards are about 5.5 inches, whereas a standard RPK has a 6-inch handguard. So technically, the M72 handguard is shorter than an RPK. This also means they don't interchange, but I think they did that to leave the exposure for these fins for cooling. It also lets the bipod sit back further. But nevertheless, because of the shorter barrel, this is about a 12-inch bipod, whereas on an RPK it's about a 13. Stuff you really don't notice until you try to put parts, go swapping parts. So I think part of the reason for the shorter handguard is for the longer allowance for a bipod, and part of it is more cooling room. What do you think? As to the RPK, as it's called, or LMG, it's always been a favorite. And when I first bought my M72, not this one here, but my very first one, I just thought of it as an RPK. It took me time to learn the differences. And it too was a Century M72 Sporter build, probably bought around 2006. Again, that's what was available, and I really liked it. It was a nice gun. It was on a Nodak receiver, as is this one. But these kits came in from our guns with the barrels. In fact, the barrels were still installed in the front trunnions, so all that needed doing was the rivets needed pressing in, and in the back, and Bob's your uncle. It was done and ready to go. We had a few of these kits back then. And this one actually has a pretty good bore, especially considering what a lot of others look like. It's just a good solid example. And what is interesting too, historically speaking, is these definitely saw service. The newer M64, as they call it, even though it is a M75 or M65 really, I'd like to keep it, but there's the problem with the rear sling swivel. I can't keep a gun unless it has a sling on it, so I don't know what I'm going to do. No, it is neat. The reason I do like having it is kind of like we've illustrated in this video. It lets me talk about the M64, M65 receiver pattern, and it does have some earlier features like the heavier top cover, non-lightning cut carrier. So it does give me an early milled LMG and then a later stamp style. And it really goes to show you how little things like the barrel and furniture changed, even with the M70s. The milled M70 and the M70B1. While the receivers changed and a few things like the bolt carrier group got lightning cuts, really the front ends remained virtually the same. Once they settled on a pattern, they kind of went with it, you know what I mean? And they made a family. And while those are the main issue variants, there were several sub-variants and even variants for export, and even in different calibers. So even though we had the M65 as the unofficial name early on, these were adopted first as the M72 fixed stock milled and M72A underfolding milled. And then we moved to the M72B1 here. And there would be an underfolding version as the M72AB1. Obviously, they never tried a 1mm receiver version of this, because why would they? And this was the standard. This is the one you always see that was produced in large numbers and used extensively inside and outside Yugoslavia. I also like this little plate here. This one has it too. That goes between the muzzle nut and the sight and helps retain the cleaning rod better. I guess they were worried it might walk out under rapid fire. Who knows? Pretty standard collar and everything there. Ovular. One thing to note, while the 1mm receivers do have the XY stampings, the dimples for the trigger pins, because of the 1.5mm, they don't have those. That is actually correct. Even though this is a US receiver, the original ones do not have the dimpling for the pivot pins either, because it's not needed. Has the slightly slimmer top cover. You see here? But surprisingly, this isn't much lighter. I mean, maybe by a couple of ounces, but the truth is they're both a bit over 12 pounds. I've always had a thing for light machine guns. And that was the big brother. You know, it's been a minute. Let's talk about what's in the holster next. While the M57 firing 7.62 Tokarev was the standard issue pistol in the holsters throughout all of the communist Yugoslavian military, There were other versions made, some for export, and some for internal use, and some for both, like this. Also adopted is the M70, is the M70 pistol here. Loosely based on the Tokarev too, this is a simple blowback, non-locked breech gun, because it fires 7.65 by 17, 32 auto, and was intended for some high-ranking officers, but also in mainly police and Ministry of Security forces. It's a little bit smaller than the old Browning 1922. It has about a 3 3/4 barrel. Overall, it's about 6 3/4 long, and it's a little bit lighter at about 24 ounces. So definitely lighter and smaller than the full size. But of course it's firing a much different cartridge, much lower power. But for personal defense, yeah. We have somewhat updated grips. We do have the same kind of concave mag release. We do have a safety. Again, kind of for police use. That's factory installed. We do have the rib on the top for better sighting. It actually comes apart like a little Tokarev. It's actually quite fun with a little bushing here and everything. They're neat little guns, they really are. And these were exported and used internally. There's not much information about these, but I actually really do like shooting mine. I've had one for a very long time now. No lanyard loop, but yeah. These would be the 2 handguns. Again, these would be produced in the 70s. And it would start a family of handguns as export seemed more and more attractive to Zastava. So we will see other versions that we will get to later on in the video. But we do have something else to talk about next. Now it's time for the M76, the DMR. At least thanks to its different lines, few mistake this for an SVD Dragunov, unlike the Romanian PSL. But they're all related to one degree or another. This is probably the most unique one. So after the AK was adopted as the AP M70, the Yugoslavian military, the government wanted a designated marksman rifle for longer range. Semi-automatic, firing a full power round with a scope, but also could be used in a backup role, secondary role, as a battle rifle. And for various political and economic reasons, they did not want to go with the SVD Dragunov. Relations with Soviet Russia were interesting at the time. This is also why Romania went with the PSL, and in fact there was some cross-pollination. The PSL came out slightly before this, and the two did influence each other. So you might be thinking they were done with milled receivers, and for the standard rifles they were, but for this they kept on with the milled receiver. In fact, it's slightly longer, about 3/4 of an inch longer than a standard milled, and that's because this fires not 7.62 by 39 or even 7.62 by 54R, but rather 7.92 by 57 8mm Mauser. Yugoslavia never adopted X54R. They still had plenty of Mausers in service, so this was their cartridge. And frankly, because it was a rimless round, it made sense. And it would be fired from about the same barrel length, not counting the flash hider, as the M72. It's a little under 22 inches. And because of everything being a little stretched out, for example, our gas tube is longer, our gas piston is longer, our bolt carrier is longer. This is a little under 45 inches long, so it's our longest one. Without the optic on, we're about 10.5 pounds. Throw an optic on, about 12.5 pounds. But it actually balances quite well. And these were always intended to be semi-automatic only, and they fed from 10-round detachable magazines. Whereas the Romanian PSL used a last round hold open, the M76 just relied on the Yugo follower system. But it does have some other interesting features. We have a relatively long handguard. We have a 4-position adjustable gas regulator, but really you're supposed to pull off the gas tube to adjust it, so it's not really meant to be adjust on the fly. 0 is essentially off, 3 is adverse, 1 and 2 are kind of in the middle, because this was intended to fire 2 cartridges, the original M49 8mm round, but also a special DMR M75 round was kind of made for it. It was about a 198 grain bullet, so pretty massive. Because this was meant to be used as a battle rifle, it does have a bayonet lug like the PSL and SVD. It has a flash hider. It's actually part of the base. And we have interrupted threads for attaching, say, like a silencer or blank fire device or whatever. We do not have a cleaning rod under the barrel. Rather, a sectional rod is stored in the pouch where 4 mags are kept. And we have oversized wood pistol grip, the same grip that would appear on a lot of the pre-banned Mitchell's guns. And we have an interesting stock. We have a rubber recoil pad, pretty standard, but then we have a semi-pistol grip that kind of replicates the look of a Mauser, so you could use your offhand there and your firing hand here and kind of bench it or bag it for more accurate shots. So, the optic. While the M76 definitely had iron sights, adjustable front and rear out to 1,000 meters, it was intended to be used with an optic here. This was a 4-power M76 scope made by Zrak in Yugoslavia. It was basically a copy of the PSO-1 from Russia. It did not have a battery, it had tritium inside, and it was intended to hit a man-sized target. Essentially the ranges for this, these are expected to be used at from about 400 meters to 800, with 600 kind of being ideal for a man-sized target, and 1,000 being the maximum. I should point out that the M72 LMG was expected to go out to about 400 meters effectively, and the rifle about 300. Again, we're just, roughly rounding, but you get the idea. So they kind of all interlock together. And this was not ever meant to be sub-MOA. In fact, a tuned one where the scope was mated to the rifle and adjusted for the ammo it was meant to shoot was expected to be about 1.5 to 2 MOA, maybe a little more. But even though that might horrify match shooters in America, it was plenty for this gun's intended role. And of course, this is not a sniper rifle, it was a DMR. Unlike Russia that tried to pretend like the SVD was a sniper, they always called this a self-loading semi-automatic rifle. Basically, this replaced the Mauser, just going to semi-auto versus a bolt action. Still has a cold hammer forged barrel, and we're still not chrome lined. Our optic fit a side rail. It's actually a little bit different than a standard Warsaw Pact, although often they're close enough that they're interchangeable. It fit into a dovetail on the side. Here's our optic. These are typically matched at the factory. No button to take it apart because we're not launching grenades here. Standard sling though. Pretty much it's a standard M70 type, just bigger in every shape, way, and form. Still blued receiver. Again, it does have the lightning cut on the receiver as well. They took a little more time with these because they weren't going to mass produce them. They would actually keep them in production throughout the entirety of the remainder of Yugoslavia. They were pretty limited service given to special forces and whatnot in the 70s, but by the 80s they became more and more common, and they became more and more common on the squad level. And they would build roughly, estimates say, 15,000 considering the needs, that's enough. As to the M76, this is an original receiver put together kit. There were some pre-bans, but very small numbers, and there was a slightly larger number of transitional guns in the M90 series, the Cotton Customs guns. And as I mentioned, PW did try to bring some in, but then they had the third pinhole and they had to be recalled. Yeah. And from that point, you have the Century-built guns, but they're on a U.S. receiver and U.S. barrel, and they have a mixed reputation, frankly. But in general, my relationship with sniper weapons and DMRs is complicated. I really like these types of guns, but yeah, not like I could shoot them for accuracy. So I don't really keep many of them. There's just a few, for example, the real Dragunov, the PSL, and even this gun. They're just too neat, and since it is a Kalashnikov style and it is basically a big battle rifle, this one came from a friend and I just couldn't help but hang on to it, and it does kind of complete the Yugoslavian collection. So once in a blue moon I'll keep a scoped gun like this, but normally I do not, and it's not because I don't like them, it's just like I said, these kinds of guns need to be appreciated by people who can shoot them for accuracy, so I do tend to let them move along most of the time. Yeah, take the scope off, you have a pretty normal rifle, so semi-automatic only. Unfortunately, we can't import the M76 as is, because even though it was always semi-auto, it does have the third pin and the out-of-battery safety, which the ATF considers a auto-seer. So PW Arms tried in the 90s, and there had to be a recall. Same thing with the PSL. So unfortunately, the ones that are here do have to be on special U.S. compliant receivers, even though they were always just semi-auto only. This takes a standard bayonet for what it's worth. Neat gun, and again, there's a decent amount of cross-pollination with the PSL. You know, whereas the SVD has a short-stroke gas piston and a 3-lug bolt, this is still an AK system, long-stroke, 2-lug bolt, AK pattern safety. It really is just an overgrown AK. But one of the very few chambered for 8mm Mauser. That's pretty different if you think about it. And these are pretty cool. And they served alongside the rifle and the machine gun as the DMR. We had the Tokarev pistol. Well, what really replaced the need for a submachine gun? Well, we turn back to maybe a seemingly unlikely source. Not the M70 AB2, but the M70 AB1, underfolding stock, 1mm receiver, and of course this has the 16¼ barrel. This is our starting point. So now we come to the compact assault rifle, or light machine gun class, with the M92. And in the back, it's the same as the AB1, receiver, underfolding stock. The differences lie on the front, of course. Both still fire 7.62x39, and both still feed from the standard 30-round mag, although of course different ones can fit it just fine. But they took inspiration from the AKSU, the AKS 74U, the crink-off as we call it, going to a hinge top cover with a 2-position flip rear. Interestingly, whereas on the Russian and Bulgarian crinks this is spring-loaded on the hinge, including the pin for the upper handguard retainer, this is not. So they simplified it, but they also kind of beefed it up a bit. And whereas the regular AKSU has around an 8.3 to 8.5 inch barrel, this is longer at just at 10 inches. And to work with that, we have a longer gas system and longer handguard, although still shorter than standard for sure. And whereas the standard AKSU has 24mm threads. Just to be even more different, this has 26. And we do have a flip-up front low light or night sight paddle, kind of keeping on that tradition, and we still have a blued finish. Yeah, at this time, other nations have long since gone to phosphating, paint over park, whatever. And Yugoslavia, Zastava is still keeping on with the blued. And also, their classy pistol grips. And here it is with the stock deployed. No oddities here. We do have the notch in the selector that you can manually hold your bolt back with if you desire. Overall length on this, assuming we didn't have the extension on, would be about 31 inches, and when you fold the stock up, about 21. But because this is a Yugoslavian built gun, and even though people think of this as being a 1mm and kind of weak, the truth is it's pretty beefy, at least compared to a regular crank. So this weighs well over 7.5 pounds unloaded. And part of that just is the longer barrel. And it is a beefier barrel compared to your crank. But even this receiver with the trunnion here, a little bit heavier duty, as is this hinge. And of course an underfolding stock like this is going to be heavier than the Russian Bulgarian side folder. But these actually started off not for the Yugoslavians, but as the M85, chambered for 5.56 by 45, 5.56 NATO, 223. That was done for export. And they did a rifle version, known as the M80, later the M90, and it's worth pointing out that the NATO variants, which were again made for export, had chrome line bores, but 7.62 by 39 variants like this still did not. So the first ones, were in a different chambering. You start to see them dabbling more and more in 5.56 in the 80s. And that brings out the point that Yugoslavia never adopted 5.45 by 39 M74. I don't know if they were never attempted to. They went straight from 7.62 39 to 5.56 in their manufacturing. Although within Yugoslavia, they would continue using 7.62. It would be after the end of the nation, and the new nations of Serbia and Croatia would go to the NATO cartridge, but that's not the scope of this video. So I just wanted to point that out, that this kind of started off as an export thing and then was adapted for their own use right before, frankly, the end and the beginning of the Civil Wars. It was primarily issued to special forces, but it was also used as a PDW, especially for security forces, bodyguard things, that kind of thing, which you see a lot of AKSUs used for. And it was always limited use because it's a very specific thing, but it proved quite popular because we have a decently comfortable stock, all things considered. These are very stable. And with a 10-inch barrel in this cartridge, you can do pretty well. A little more oomph than 8.5 will get you. And of course, the original muzzle device is a booster, pretty much copied from the crank, but again, not interchangeable because it's in 26mm thread, not 24. But no, I really think these are neat. Of course, these come in as the M1922 pistol, and put a stock on mine a long time ago. You've seen it. You know what it is. I've always enjoyed it. I'm glad these get their appreciation finally. And they really are just this gun with a different front end and top cover. Of course, the different bolt carrier group as well. So, I have one more to show you. And then finally, last on the couch is the PAP M92PV. These came in and still come in as pistols. Century was the first importer, now it's Zastava USA. And they were always a really cool deal. They were built from new parts over there in Serbia. They were reasonably priced. They were cheaper than buying a parts kit and having it built here, which we had a good number of Virgin M92 parts. And they actually still have an underfolding rear trunnion. It's just blank, So installing a stock, I know this is a Yugo stock, it's pretty straightforward. You have to cut the trunnion and the receiver for it. But as long as you do that, it installs quite nicely. And then you can either SBR it or just put on an extended brake like I did. I'm very happy with this gun. For a couple of years, people passed around rumors about them being made of soft steel and all this stuff, but the truth is there are tens, maybe even 100,000 in the US now. Most of them are still running fine. I mean, any gun can run out, that's true. And I've often suspected that some of the Zastava guns had weak recoil springs, maybe intentionally installed so they'll run with all kinds of ammo. So I've often thought replacing the recoil spring with a standard one or even a slightly extra power one is not a bad idea. So if you're worried about wearing out your M92, that's what I would do. But this is a factory-built military-style gun. And it takes original mags. It's in the original caliber. It even has a threaded barrel from the factory. It even has the flip-up night sight from the factory. How can you do better? Now, I don't have any of the 5.56 guns. That's not to say I don't think they're good. I do. The M85, the M90. And if an M21 comes in, I would probably grab it. But we have to draw the line somewhere. Kind of like I was talking about at the beginning of this video with the Mausers. I can like something or respect something, enjoy shooting something, but not necessarily want to own it myself. Same goes, I've got the M76. I've had the M91, but moved it along. I've had the M77 to 308 and moved it along. They were both good guns, but you can't keep everything, so keep your favorites. And between this version and the M85, I prefer the 760x39. Personal choice. I actually do think if I were to keep one other caliber or other type, it'd probably be the M90. I do like the current 18-inch barreled M90 and 5.56. It's just a really nice gun for what it is. But I'm trying to keep this collection to Yugoslavian. So we're looking at guns from 1919 through 1992, 1993, in that time frame. And at that time, this is what they were using. But yeah, the M92s really neat. In fact, the whole PAP series have just been getting better and better. Back when EAA imported them, it was not great, but there was potential. Then Century took over and things got better. And then the NPAPs came along and they were better than the original PAPs. Then the OPAPs came along after the NPAPs and they were better. And today we have the ZPAPs and they're better yet still. So it's been a slow, gradual, but consistent improvement over time. And that is what's so cool. And that's our rifles, but we have one more. And it might kind of seem underwhelming, but it's one of my favorite guns, believe it or not. Returning to handguns. This might seem unassuming at first, but it's actually something I wanted for a very long time and was very happy to get. Why is that? Well, this was the standard. This was kind of meant to be issued to police and some high ranking and of course exported. But by the 1980s, they realized that they should, move away from 7.62 by 25 Tokarev, but also 32 7.65 Browning won't cut it. Let's go to standard 9x19 Parabellum 9mm NATO. Interesting that they did not adopt 9x18 Makarov. You would think they might have, considering how close it was to 380, but maybe that's the exact reason they didn't. So Zastava worked with this. Now, going back to 1970, there was not only just the M70, but there was also the M70A, which was essentially this pistol, but chambered for 9mm. Now, we've seen those in the U.S. over the years. But that's a full-size gun with a 4.6-inch barrel. The M88 here is meant to be a medium-size, kind of splitting the difference between these two gun. It's got about a 3.8-inch barrel, and it's about 6.9 inches long, so just a hair under 7 inches. And weight-wise, it's about 27 ounces, so lighter than the 57, but heavier than the 70. It really is just splitting the difference. Pretty well standard Tokarev design, still single action only, still a steel framed, steel slide gun. Still has a magazine disconnect safety, and we do start to see these offered from the factory with an optional slide safety here. And this was expected to be the next service gun within Yugoslavia, kind of replacing some Tokarevs, some M70s, again, well suited for officers, police. It's a good medium-sized gun, frankly. It feels good in the hand. But then the civil wars started. When that happened, these had only been really made in small batches, but they were produced during the wars, and this is why you see the switch from synthetic grips and more of a dark, lustrous bluing to these slab-side wood grips, and kind of more of a matte, almost pale bluing, kind of a grayish blue. You can tell that these were built at the end and under a little bit of duress. So they did see service during the Civil Wars, but things were changing. So instead of this becoming their next standard issue gun, the few that were produced for their military ended up being used for training troops. They were carried a little bit, used in combat a little bit, carried by police a little bit, but they realized this is a pretty old style design. Single action, single stack, all steel. Eventually they would start making what was known as the CZ99, a much more modern pistol inspired by the Walther P88 and Sig Sauer P226 kind of mushed together. And that would end up being Serbia's next gun. And of course Croatia would go in a different direction with the HS products guns, which would ultimately give us the Springfield XT series. But this is what could have been. And while you can get commercial M88As in America, and they're actually really good values for what they are, I always wanted a true surplus one here. Ironically, paying more for a beat-up gun than a new one, but they're the ones that only have the wood grips and this kind of unique finish. The newer 21st century ones have a more traditional grip and everything. They're better guns, but these are more interesting with history and amongst the very last firearms to come out of Yugoslavia before it fell apart. Beginning, of course, in 1992. And so, that seemed like a good place to end, looking at the handguns. Kind of interesting what they did and didn't adopt from Soviet Russia, cartridges and guns alike. What do you think? Alrighty, guys. Well, a couple hours spent hanging out and talking Yugoslavian Zastava guns. I don't have everything, not even close to it. Some guys have complete collections, and you definitely can, on Yugoslavian guns. All the different variations, different receiver types and stock types, and of course calibers, and there's a lot there. But they definitely did their own thing, as we can see from the very beginning. Even having the M48 with its unique length receiver borrowed from the FN M1924. And of course their pistols, I really find interesting too. But which guns do you like? What's your favorite? They make well-made and very reliable, very rugged guns. I think most people would agree with that, especially in the AK world. But hope everyone has a good weekend. Please feel free to comment and share your own collections. And as always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help out, check out Patreon. With that, this is Misha, Catch you very soon next time.